Hello everyone, thank you for joining Carla 2020 and welcome to today's discussion, which is aptly entitled, Do You Care About Inclusive Film, Realpolitik? Today's conversation is the second installment of two conversations on inclusion I've been co-curated with ProQuote and with Germany. My name is Themba Bhebhe. I'm a film industry programmer with several specialities, one of which is diversity and inclusion, in particular at the European film market, where I've been in charge of the diversity and inclusion initiative for the past 3 years. And today I'm extremely honored to be one of the moderators and program advisors of Carla 2020. And as such, I wanted to say a special thank you to our friends from WIFTI for doing such an excellent job in bringing together so many speakers from the film industry, as well as researchers and activists to create synergies and really push the needle forward in terms of the way we imagine and move forward to more inclusive industry. I also wanted to say some words of thanks to our partners. So this particular conversation and its tandem conversation, Do You Care About Inclusion Part 1, were curated in partnership with ProQuote Film and with Germany. For this reason, I wanted to thank in particular Nico Hofmann from WIFT, as well as Barbara Rome and Yvonne de Andres from ProQuote for their help and input in shaping this conversation. As you can probably tell by the reference to the quintessentially German concept of Realpolitik, our conversation will focus more particularly on the German film industry. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the global uprising against racism, this subject matter has now more than ever a sense of urgency. During the conversation, we'll first of all gain a privileged insight into the new groundbreaking study on inclusion and discrimination in front and behind the camera called Vielfalt in Film, which for those non-German speakers, translates to diversity in film. This new survey will be presented in a few moments by Joshua Kwesi Atkins from the civil society organization Citizens for Europe. Our insights into that study will then allow us to explore the pressing opportunities for more policymaking, initiatives, and ultimately action of organizations, businesses, and institutions at regional and federal level in Germany. Joining me today will be 5 guests who are all in their respective fields working towards the goal of diversifying the German film industry. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our guests today, Joshua Kwesi Atkins, who will be presenting the Vielfalt in Film survey, Chun, Nico Hofmann, Susann, Reck, and Helge Albers. Thank you for joining us today. So if you could briefly introduce yourselves and your organization, if we could start perhaps with Joshua Kwesi Atkins.
Yes, Themba, thanks for having me. My name is Joshua Kwesi Atkins. I'm a senior researcher with Citizens for Europe. That's a civil society organization based in Berlin, and we do equality data. We conduct surveys and investigations into how to increase equality and opportunity, access, and broad inclusion. And one of our projects is Vielfalt im Film, which I'm going to present to you in a minute.
And next, Chun.
Hello, I'm Chun. I'm born and raised in Amsterdam, and at the moment I'm an actress and agent for actresses and actors, and I'm a business systemic coach. I've played for several years on all stages in Germany, and at the moment I'm in the extended board of the Deutsche Akademie für Fernsehen, and I'm a regular member of ProQuote Film.
Thank you, Chun. So I will go clockwise around the screen as I see it. So the next person up is Susann Reck.
Hello, and thanks again a lot for inviting me today. First of all, I'm Susann, author, director, and networker for the Queer Media Society. And today I'm representing our film section. So founded in 2018, we are still a very young nationwide network for queer media professionals organized on a voluntary basis. And with around 400 members in only 2 years, we can say we are quite successful, which shows the urgency of our network. We fight against discrimination of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, as well as non-binary, trans, and inter people in the media. And according to our understanding, diversity doesn't stop with distinction between man and woman, but also diversity doesn't mean the simple distinction between queer and not queer. We have in mind that there has to be diversity within the rainbow too. We have to represent queer women, queer disabled people. We have to deal with age discrimination, the discrimination of queer people of color and BAME people. We believe in gender equity. That all sounds a little bit complicated, many special cases we have to deal with, and honestly it is. We have to differentiate all the time. On the other hand, we have to carry out our goals for more visibility and representation in a compact, handy way. So we have to find a balance all the time. And let me add one last thing. For decades, I've had the experience of not appearing, of not having role models, desperately looking for traces of positive examples of queer women in the media, but I hardly found any. So my conclusion is today, we were a bunch of lonesome fighters. Together, we are more powerful.
Thank you, Susann. Thank you very much for those insights. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to dive back into all the amazing work which Queer Media Society is doing at the moment. Next up is Helge Albers. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Themba. Thanks for having me. My name is Helge. I'm the CEO of the Filmförderung Hamburg, Schleswig, Holstein. We are one of the regional film funds in Germany. And yeah, we support our regional industry. We support feature films predominantly, high-end TV series as well. And yeah, we'll speak about the rest later, I think.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Nico Hofmann.
Yeah, my name is Nico Hofmann. I'm sitting in Berlin. I'm running UFA Film as a CEO. UFA is one of the bigger media companies in Germany. Basically, we are producing shows, fiction, entertainment, documentaries. I was a former director in my former life. I was directing films for many years, then I started to produce. And yeah, it's a big topic for me to have the diversity discussion going on here at UFA with all employees. And I love to join the discussion.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for making time to participate in this, as I said, very timely and essential conversation. Before we dive in and get started, I do have a note on housekeeping of a very particular nature. I just have a reminder about the ethos of Carla 2020. So we actually have a pledge that we're upholding. It's a pledge that all the participants have to sign and commit to when they register with the conference. The pledge lays down some ground rules on anti-discrimination, mutual respect, and cultural safety. It reads as follows. So our speakers do not and will not condone any forms of discrimination by themselves or perpetrated by others on the basis of ethnicity, religion, geographical origin, skin color, religious beliefs, sexuality, gender identity, socio-economic class, disability, or age. Our speakers declare that they do not and will not tolerate sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, ableism, fascism, and other isms. So whatever the ism is, they have no place in 2020. I'm more than certain that all of our guests today are more than cognizant of the values embedded in that statement, but we as a conference actually felt it was very important to reiterate that our spaces of dialogue should above all be safe spaces. So I just wanted to make that clear for both our guests and also our viewers. If we could cue the first slide of the presentation, that would be great. While the presentation, there we go, perfect. Wonderful, the wonders of technology. So as I mentioned earlier, the point of departure of this conversation will be the much awaited Vielfalt Film survey and study by asking questions such as how diverse is the German film and TV sector, who is included in front of the camera and behind the camera, and more importantly, who isn't, which forms of discrimination and exclusions exist, and how the industry can be fair and more inclusive. By asking all of these questions, the survey will provide the most in-depth insight yet into the experience of film professionals from marginalized groups in Germany. So Joshua, the floor is yours. Kwesi, sorry, the floor is yours. Kwesi, I think your microphone is muted.
Okay, so now?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Sorry about that. Yes, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present Vielfalt im Film, as Themba already mentioned. And if you could move on to the second slide. Thank you. The tagline of the project is Vielfalt und Diskriminierung vor und hinter der Kamera, which translates to diversity and discrimination in front of and behind the camera. So this is the first comprehensive and importantly also intersectional survey on diversity and exclusion in the German film industry. So we focus on the experiences of people working in the industry, and we do that by building on criticism of and also by recognizing that there is an exclusive and also a discriminatory status quo. And this criticism has long been voiced by women, people of color, people with disability, queer people, and other groups in this country. And we have taken cognizance of that and have striven to create this project to shed more light on this. If you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the idea is, or the aims are really to generate differentiated insights into these experiences. And this is for the German-speaking region, including Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And the idea is that we want to make these experiences of exclusion, as well as coping strategies, also the demand that people have and the agency of professionals in front of and behind the camera visible. We want to offer analyses and experiences and the insights from that agency of the respondents to the survey to effect positive change at all levels of the industry. So we want to inform conversations, but also policies, and importantly also funding and anti-discrimination practice with the data we are generating. So all of this is to empower the sustainable diversification of the German-speaking film industry. Moving on to the next slide. You might ask yourself, okay, so why do it in this way? We believe it's important to gather equality data on the German film industry, the German-speaking film industry, because discrimination is not just a question of personal opinions, right? Inequality is embedded in societies and of course also in institutions and industries. And that's why you know, there's a discrepancy between German society as it is lived and experienced, and German-speaking societies, of course, also in Switzerland and Austria, and what you can see on the screen and, you know, in film representing these societies. So the idea is that you need differentiated data to be able to more fully understand the dynamics of exclusion, the gaps that it creates, right? And then also to be able to use that data to actually mobilize in terms of policies and measures towards equality. Why is this important? Because such data is crucial to enable decision makers to actually enact the needed policies and also measures, right? So we're talking all the way from the political level to the level of you know, individual productions and projects. All of these dimensions can be elucidated by equality data. Now, moving on to the next slide, please. And this was also already part of our conversation. This is a special moment in time where it is important to actually intervene and provide this data now. Now, we have a long-standing tradition in Germany with such data collection, but only for binary ideas of gender representation. Now, what we're doing is we're including other dimensions and importantly also their intersections. And we believe this is also an opportunity to literally leapfrog, meaning going beyond some of the practices in the US and the UK. Now, to be very clear, we draw a lot of inspiration from these contexts. They're really important. And in many respects, they are, if you want to say it that way, further ahead. However, we also believe that we can learn from these contexts and go beyond them in terms of being a bit more differentiated in the ways in which we look at discrimination, for example, by differentiating between self-identification and the identification that is relevant in the context of discrimination, because these two things might and often do differ. We also believe it's important to gather this data right now because Germany needs to keep up with the industry. There are inclusion riders, and I believe we will get into this later in more detail, but there are policies, there are production houses that require a certain kind of diversity across different dimensions. And so for German productions to be able to keep up and to partner and to interface with production houses such as Warner Brothers and others, it is important to gather such data. And lastly, of course, we do believe that both the Black Lives Matter movement, the global uprising and debate it has engendered, and also the Corona crisis make it obvious change is necessary. Now, moving on, just to wrap it up, in the German context, it is important for us to recognize that we need to go far beyond the problematic idea of migration background. That's the only statistical concept that is mobilized in Germany to talk about discrimination beyond this binary idea of gender. But of course, even the federal government has come out to recognize that, for example, when talking about racism, there are 4 groups that are particularly vulnerable. And these are Black people, people discriminated as Muslims, Jewish people, and Sinti and Roma. And what this graphic here simply illustrates is the fact that some of these people might have a migration background, but many increasing numbers do not have this migration background anymore because they have been in the country for 3 or more generations. So that the migration background cuts off after the 2nd generation, making this statistical tool ever more blunt when actually looking at discrimination. Moving on to the next slide. What is even more important or equally important for us to recognize is how different dimensions of discrimination intersect. So what we call intersectionality is really the complex ways in which different aspects of identity, identification, and also ascription by society combine. So if you consider this image of a hijab wearing Black lady, you begin to understand how, in this case, racism, sexism, and other dynamics of exclusion can combine to create specific dynamics of exclusion. That is what we call intersectionality, and that is what we also have to look at, because it's the reality of discrimination, a reality of life. Nobody is just a single thing. Nobody is just one item, one dimensional. So we have to look at how these dimensions intersect. Now, to wrap up, moving on to the next slide, I believe we can go into more detail probably later. Just briefly here, what are we asking in this online survey that's still running for 1 more month? So it's still possible to partake. We want to invite every person working in the German-speaking movie industry to partake in the survey. So of course, we are asking what's the current situation of the person within the industry. We're asking about experience of discrimination. And what is important to you to note, and Themba already mentioned it in his housekeeping notes, right? That we're looking there at the General Equal Treatment Act. So we look at the dimensions of gender and sexual identity, the so-called ethnic origin, or maybe more precisely racial discrimination. We look at age, we look at disability, we look at religion or worldview, but we go beyond the General Equal Treatment Act. And we also add the dimension of social status, and important in the German context, we also add the dimension of a West German versus an East German socialization. And then, of course, we also ask about, diversity. We ask about the work climate on set. And we ask about how people evaluate the measures already being taken. How do they experience those? Now, moving on. So I think there's no time to go through them. I just want to mention that we have consulted with various players, and we are asking measures that are already being taken or that are in discussion and contention, and we ask people to evaluate how important they might find those. And what we believe is important to note that it's also helpful to consider that different groups might experience the effectiveness of certain measures differently. So there again, it's about the intersection, it's about looking at it in a differentiated way. Now in closing, the last slide, please. I would like to point out that this project is only possible because there is a whole huge list of partners. And I want to draw specific attention to the first block of names here, the initiators, because there you can see how there is a broad swath of self-organizations, including, for example, the Queer Media Society, ProQuote Film, Schwarze Filmschaffende in Deutschland, the Film University Babelsberg, and many, many others. These are the organizations that actually stand behind this project and are moving it forward. I would be remiss if I wouldn't mention that, of course, we have financial support from the Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency and many others. And importantly, we also have the support of many, many other professional organizations that are also inviting their members to participate. So as you can see, there is a broad movement behind this. And yeah, we want to encourage everyone who is part of the industry, who has not taken part yet, to visit the website and you know, partake in the study. Thank you. Oh.
I think you said that the survey is still online for another month?
Yes, exactly. It will be online for another month.
Fantastic. And thank you, Kwesi, for summarizing so concisely and so effectively such a far-reaching, complex study. I think there are two characteristics which really distinguish this study. One of them is, as you said, the broad alliance of organizations which are really behind the study, which form a movement to really create a platform for the study. And the other is the fact that one of the most salient points behind the study is that it's ultimately aimed at being a basis for recommendations, policies, and we hope action, right? So that's the real goal once the study is completed further down the line. I wanted to first of all turn our attention to Chun Tan. Chun, welcome once again. We had a really pleasant, candid talk last week where you told me that you yourself had experienced discrimination earlier in your career as an actress, where you were essentially deprived of many roles or else offered roles which were, let's say, racially reductive or stereotyped. But before we look at how to prevent others from having those experiences, I wanted to find out what, in your view, is really the root cause of all the discriminations which will be highlighted in the Filmförderung in Film survey.
Well, I think power has always defined itself in such a way that it's that's the right of the stronger applies. So the one who is stronger has the might. Mm-hmm. And when we look in history, man oppression women, that was the first mightness. And when you see this over all those 1,000 years of patriarchal systems, you see that this is crept into society and everybody actually finds it normal that we oppress weakness. And first of all, women were weaker, and diverse people are weaker and are a minority. But first of all, it starts by the oppression of man against woman. And I think that is something we should not forget. Even in diversity, we need a gender equality because men are more important than women. That's the way it is, and it maintains. And I think that we shouldn't forget.
And so you kind of touch upon the subject of intersectionality, you know, this idea of overlapping forms of discrimination, and you've talked about patriarchy, and quite often, if you look at that from an intersectional point of view, the sources of those different discriminations, patriarchy, white supremacy, homophobia, are essentially the same. They essentially overlap. In terms now of how to combat those forms of discrimination. So we've talked about diversity, you've talked about gender equality, the oppression of women, yet women aren't a minority despite being marginalized. So in your view, does this mean that gender-based discrimination and other forms of discrimination should be combated separately? I think one of the more specific East German problems is the very definition of the term diversity in Germany, which is often stands in for gender. We have reports which are called, you know, diversity in film, and they're actually only or mainly about gender. And in other contexts, we've seen where gender equality and other forms of diversity have been pitted off against one another. So walk us through your position on how gender relates to other forms of discrimination in the field.
Well, Diversity, we must pay attention. That's what I already said. We must pay attention. Diversity is not female. Diversity is man and woman. And we have to pay attention within the diversity that there will be a gender equality. I think the mixed up between gender and diversity is that we are both weaker than the man maintains. And that's why we mixed it up. But it's not the same. Diversity and female rights are not the same. Yeah, I think that's the main point. And when I look at myself, I think it's exactly that. First, it started on a woman, so we are not in the cast. We are only 30% of a cast, and then I'm diverse, and so I got no chance to play. And then I became older, and then I got no chance to play because they don't want elder actresses. And even when they are diverse, they can't. The thing they always said to me, we can't tell your face. It's not into our society. You're not fit in these films. We can't tell your face. There's no place. And I said, but I'm here in Germany since over 30 years. I said, okay, but the story doesn't tell it. We don't have women like you in films, not in the plays, not in the scripts. I'm blind.
Exactly. But I mean, the question is, do you think that certain non-profits or organizations should combat separate diversity or the forms of diversity, such as ethnic diversity, and separately gender equality? Are those two struggles separate struggles, or are they overlapping struggles? For instance, can you imagine that if, let's say, one of the criticisms about what was called traditional feminism was that feminism only really looked after the interests of privileged white women, right? And so many of these feminist movements have become much more intersectional in their view, in their scope, and have taken on the ideas of combating other forms of diversity within their focus on gender. So yeah, I wanted to kind of find out what your position is on that particular subject. If you think that both gender equality and other forms of diversity should be combated at the same time or separately?
I think you can't. You can't split them from each other, but they got different meanings. But you can't. Of course, diversity and gender equality has to be both important, but you can't mix them up. That's what I want to say. You have to split them. There are two different things, but we're fighting for the same thing. We want to be on screen. We want to be that people look at us. But I don't think it's the same. I hope I understand your question.
Completely. And I'd love to continue talking with you, delving with you further into this particular topic, but for reasons of time, I have to move on to the next topic. But thank you very much for your contribution. One of the concrete measures that has been implemented to bring down barriers in the industry, and one of the countries which has adopted it, is the UK. So the British Film Institute's diversity standards encompass a points-based system for funding that aims at ensuring that films funded by the Institute look like the composition of the UK's population in terms of gender, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. Melanie, the BFI's industry inclusion executive, very kindly sent us a short video providing details of the BFI's diversity standards. So if you could cue and show that video, which Melanie very kindly presented. Perfect. Let's get the video started. Oh, there's a problem with the sound.
In front of the camera, which doesn't just address the number of people on screen, but the quality and scope of their representation. Section B tackles creative leadership and senior roles behind the camera. Section C looks at the provision of training and promotion opportunities. And Section D is centered around audiences, access, and distribution. The standards are meant to open a discussion around representation before time and budget pressures mean that these issues get pushed down the priority list. They give time to allow for thinking around how everyday decisions may lead to a lack of diversity on your production and how you might do things differently to ensure that this isn't the case. The standards were developed to be used as a requirement on the films for BFI funds, but have subsequently been adopted by BBC Films, Film 4, Paramount for their productions, and BAFTA, BIFA, and most recently AMPATS as part of the eligibility criteria for their awards. This uptake from industry displays a movement towards the collaborative global effort needed to create lasting change and a more representative sector. They're a work in progress, and we use data and reporting to tell us where they're working and where we need to amplify their use and adjust our policy and offering to help the industry to meet them. Most recently, we adapted the criteria for television when the Young Audiences Content Fund was established, further highlighting the ability for these standards to be utilised across the visual arts, and we continue to encourage more people to do so.
Thank you. So now turning to Joshua Kwesi Atkins. Kwesi, we had a slight problem with the sound at the beginning, but that could be corrected further down the line. You obviously know the BFI's diversity standards quite well. It's a model which has really been exported across the world, as Melanie has so generously shared with us. Is it conceivable that such a system like the BFI's diversity standards could be implemented in Germany? And if so, how would you have to adapt this points-based system?
Yeah, first of all, I think it is a great inspiration, and it is important to see that, I mean, how serious thought has gone into designing this to avoid specific pitfalls, for example, with what we call tokenistic representation, where you have individuals, say of color or women or whatever diversity dimension you want to talk about, who are then, you know, put in specific roles, but you don't have sustained opportunities for them. And this is what the BFI also tackles in some of the modules that we just heard about. So this is a huge inspiration. However, I do think it's important to adapt some of these things to the German context. So I spoke earlier about the importance to leapfrog some of the ideas that come from US and UK contexts and adapt them to the German historical context, where, for example, we have certain dimensions that don't feature in the BFI. Say, for example, you know, East and West German socialization, or, as I said earlier, the differentiation between, you know, how I self-identify or how somebody self-identifies and what they are seen as and what they are discriminated as. Mm-hmm. Now, if the question is about how to implement that, I believe, you know, the difference between the UK and Germany is, of course, that there is a broad practice of gathering certain kinds of equality data, which we do not have here. And that is why Vielfalt im Film is making what we believe is a necessary first step to actually gain a deeper understanding about the dynamics of discrimination and exclusion in the film industry, and also the ways in which they intersect, right? So we just heard about, you know, this experience of an actress of color in this country. And she also mentioned the issue of age, right? So I think it's important for us to really see how these things intersect, how issues like sexual harassment, which is also a key topic that we're asking about in Vielfalt im Film, intersects with, say, age, with, say, you know, being a person of color, experiencing racism, and many, many other dimensions, and then draw from this more differentiated picture a pathway towards something that in the end could approximate what we've just heard from the UK. In my view, this would entail changing funding policy, changing and strengthening protections from discrimination on set in the context of productions, right? And again, gaining an understanding about the intersectional workings of exclusion and specific vulnerabilities. And talking about vulnerabilities, I want to briefly mention the issue of the Corona crisis, which we are facing right now, which also heightens vulnerabilities for people in the film sector. Because we just had the example of the actress and age, I want to say that, for example, when it comes to acceptability for certain roles, if we know that there are certain vulnerabilities connected to age and racial discrimination, We know that these are now heightened in the context of the corona crisis, which is why we are asking about these specific experiences as well, to enable us to understand how structural forces of exclusion are heightened during crisis in ways that will enable us to intervene in the short run, but also build more equitable structures in the medium and long term.
Thank you, Kwesi. And I think it's great that you're very much factoring in that factor of the COVID-19 pandemic, because the way in which that pandemic laid bare the structural inequalities which exist in the world, and the way in which it disproportionately affected marginalized groups across the world, the way in which Black and brown bodies were very much affected by this pandemic across the world, was very much something which was lacking from mainstream media. And so it's great that the study really does take this into account, importantly. So now moving to Susann and Reck. Queer Media Society is indeed a partner also of Field Fighting Film, and was launched last year with the aim of visibilizing queer people and queer narratives in the entire media sector. Queer Media Society also aims at challenging queer-phobic narratives propelled in the media and of creating a greater intersectional diversity within queer narratives, inclusion and decision-making. You, like ProQuote and many other organizations, also advocate for the introduction of a quota based on what you call a gap in the media representation of queer people. Walk us through this gap in queer representation, Susan.
Well, yes, first of all, there is this gap, and we want to close it, of course. So there is the gap between our LGBTIQ representation in the German population, which is about 7.4%. And on the other hand, the representation in the media, I refer to film and TV, which is like 0. So 7.4% of the German population is gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans, yeah? But the media in no way represent that. We are nearly not visible. That's what we want to change, of course. We have to increase our visibility.
Fantastic. And you told me last week when we spoke that there's another study due out by the Malese Stiftung next year. Do you think?
Yeah, that's right. But I think it cannot be assumed that the gap has been closed then. I mean, the representation has probably increased a little bit, but I think that's all. So what Elisabeth Krommer said, I would like to cite that, because I think it's still very true. The representation of LGBTIQs is under the radar. The German TV and cinema is heterosexual, yeah. And there is even this buzzing, this figure buzzing around about 0.2%. That's really, I mean, nothing. And for queer women, it's even worse. So we have to deal with the fact that within the rainbow, there is no gender equity at all. Gay men are meant when it comes to LGBTIQ in film. And I'm completely, I agree with Chun May, who says that we have very different history. There is a very different history of men and women, and there are different roles within the patriarchal structures. So women in general are less visible in film than men. Yeah. And across all programs in Germany, we have twice as many men than women on screen. So I think we have to increase the visibility for queer women.
Thank you. And it's interesting that we come back again and again to this idea of intersectionality. And again, you know, that's what you're saying. There's a lack of intersectionality within the queer representation in Germany. That representation is mainly cisgender, it's mainly male, it's mainly white. And so it's a question of redressing the balances within that queer representation. You've also noticed, and I think it's fairly visible to most people, a gap between, on the one hand, representations of queerness and their numbers, their flourishing, their proliferation in the international sphere, especially in the streaming, on the streaming platforms, and queer representation on German TV. Walk us through that gap also.
Well, the problem is that the national market is often equated with the international one. So when it comes to LGBTIQ films, people tell us, well, what do you want? There is so many films now on streaming services, on film festivals, even in media libraries. You just can see international films everywhere now. they are available, but it's not, I have to point out, that's not the German market. It's the US situation, and this is really different.
Indeed. Thank you, Susan. So I wanted to move on to Nico Hofmann. Nico, you're acquainted with many of the guests in this virtual room, as you yourself are a partner of Filmförderung Film, and you're also a network at Queer Media Society. Can you advocate, can you share your motivations for advocating for such initiatives? Your microphone is muted.
It works now?
Perfect.
Okay, somebody shut it down. Okay, I try to make it on a very personal level. First of all, as an openly gay living man in Berlin, one of my longest friends, David, he came from Palestine. We were together for nearly 10 years. So I have a very deep personal impact in my life to live in the German media society in the last, I'm 60 now, in the last 40 years. So things are changing. The other big thing is, I have to say, I come from a very, very strong female background. I was grown up by a mother who was a feminist person in the 70s. She was the first editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung as a female member of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And I had a very strong divorce because my parents got separated because my father was not so successful like my mother. So I came from a very, very special background in my own personal life. And I agree with nearly everything which is said today, because if you have a view to the German landscape, there are a lot of individual people in Germany really living their own lives, being very productive, being very openly seen in society, but it's absolutely not reflected in our program. If you see the daily program, if you see the so-called public program in Germany, it's a very, very conservative society, and it's a very, very conservative program. So there are many things to do, and that's the reason why I really support all these movements at the moment, and I think we have a big change going on in Germany in those days.
Thank you. And we'll come back to this idea of the mandate of public stations, but also private stations to reflect the German society in its composition. I wanted to also ask you about an announcement with UFA, which was made earlier this year. You announced a collaboration between Panther Entertainment, a production company which is led by two leading Afro-German producers, Natalie Kudjebo and Tyron Ricketts. Can you tell us how this collaboration came into being? But I'd also be interested to know if you have plans for further collaborations with other people from other marginalized groups. Do you have plans to collaborate with producers from the Turkish German or Kurdish German community, for example?
Yeah, I'll make it very brief because we can talk about 3 hours. Natalie Kudjebo and Tyron Ricketts are just friends for many, many years. So I'm a big admirer of Natalie Kudjebo's work in the last 5 years. So it's basically a question of quality, why I asked her for years to join UFA. I'm not talking about her background, I'm talking about her quality as a producer. And the same is with Tyron. You know, when I started my producer's career, one of my first films I produced in one of the leading roles, and we always got connected in some way. So we talk about the quality of people, and that was the first move, to have Tyron and Natalie getting combined in this new company. And the second move was something we did 3 weeks ago. We founded with Jörg Winger, who is one of my most successful producers doing Deutschland 83 and other films here for UFA. We founded Big Window, and if you see the members of Big Window, it's a company between UFA, Fremantle, and Jörg. It's a totally mixed crew. So he has people from India, from New York, many people from mixed origins and backgrounds, and that's the way we want to restructure, if you ask me, the whole UFA family, because UFA is a 100-year-old business here in Germany, and it needs tons of times to get structures rechanged, but we're in the middle of the road.
And I think essentially what you say can be described in the term intentionality, and that's something that I also want to touch on in my next question. Because as the CEO of UFA and as a leading member of the German Producers Alliance, the Produzenten Allianz, Can you share any plans or insights regarding diversity inclusion? Do you have any plans to diversify perhaps the teams at UFA, or diversify even the membership at the Producers Alliance?
If we talk about this, I must make it very clear that we will change it. I have a meeting in 2 days in this room, and we have a big group of people. You know, it's not only about me. We talk within UFA, we talk about, I can only talk about numbers, not about names, but we have more than 30% of the members of the UFA family are living gay, lesbian, transgender way of life, you know. So it's not only about me, it's about a full structure behind me, really demanding for a change in the structure of UFA, demanding for a change in the programs we are doing, demanding for a change in the way we produce. So it's not only about me, it's really about the background of people, especially younger people, pushing their demands. And if I make another viewpoint, you know, I'm a teacher at the film school in Ludwigsburg in Baden-Württemberg. And if I see all the classes in the last years, how they changed, Burhan Kabani, who did Berlin Alexanderplatz, was one of my diploma students. And I'm extremely proud of his work. I was really totally touched by the film when I was going to the Berlinale and saw his film. It's a unique German topic to have Berlin Alexanderplatz played and reacted in some way by this international crew. And Burhan is coming from Afghanistan. So you see all in the educational programs and the people coming from the universities, it's a complete mixed group of people with different backgrounds. And that's all these kinds of energies pushing into the market. And I'm really a big fan of these changes.
Thank you, and I'm very, very excited by your question. And I know time is tight, but I will ask you one last question because it's, I think it's quite important given what you've just said. One of the topics that I've discussed with everyone in this room is the idea of sustainability. So you've just talked about bringing this emerging, up-and-coming, diverse generation of young Germans or young people of diverse backgrounds living in Germany into the film and TV industry. One of the most important ideas around diversity inclusion is making sure that the sector, that the production sector, that the programming sector is made to be sustainable. It's the idea that when they arrive in this sector, that they will be valued and nurtured. Chun shared with me earlier on, you know, the way in which when she was an actress, she came into the acting sector in the theatre, and her presence there wasn't sustainable because of so many forms of structural discrimination and barriers which she had to face. So what can be done structurally in order to make those spaces much more sustainable for this younger up-and-coming generation?
Look, my deep belief is that society in Germany is deeply changing at the moment. I'm very often in the UK. If you see the UK society, it's a clearly, and I see that very positive, it's a very clearly mixed society. People from various backgrounds are living together. If you go to Germany 20 years ago, basically people were coming from Turkey, from Italy, and from Germany. If you go now to Germany, and I see it with my students are coming from all over the world, of people from Iraq, from Afghanistan, not only from Turkey and Italy. And society is changing. I deeply believe that in 3 or 4 years, we will have a very clear understanding that this is an international society and not a pure German society in the sense of the right-wing populist movement here in Berlin. I really think it will change. And if you see the energy coming from the younger generation of filmmakers, bringing their own actors, that's the way how Tyron Ricketts started his career. Tyron we talk about a program we did 20 years ago. So he was 28 or 20, no, sorry, he was 22 or 23. So things are changing profoundly in these days. And hopefully we will manage to get a deeper solidarity feeling amongst us to step up really openly to discuss this.
Thank you. It's very interesting what you say, being a Black British person myself. My view of the UK isn't at all as utopian as yours, perhaps. I'd also say that, you talk about Germany, and I'd say that the change for me, living here in Berlin, being someone who's Black British, but also lived in France, lived in Paris for a long time, and lived here in Berlin, specifically in Schöneberg, for me the change has already taken place. When I step outside of my door, I see Afro-Germans, Turkish Germans, Asian Germans. For me, that's just that diverse society is already there. It's just not necessarily reflected in the industries or in the images which I see portrayed on the screen. Last but not least, Helge, Albers, and thank you very much, Nico, for your candid contribution. Last but not least, Helge, so you've patiently, and thank you for waiting until the end, Heard details of field fighting film, you've heard strong arguments for quotas, you've seen examples of effective measures in other European countries. Hamburg Schleswig Holstein Film Fund recently launched a first of its kind diversity checklist for all the applicants to its funding streams. All the funding applicants must now complete a mandatory checklist requiring them to provide inclusion data on their teams and narratives. In the cases of projects which lack inclusivity, the applicants have to just justify their choices. So significantly, this checklist is voluntary in nature, in that it doesn't require the applicants to reach inclusion goals, quotas, or involve any type of bonus or incentives. I'd be interested to know why you chose this particular model. Walk us through the background of this initiative and share your insights into its aims.
I mean, the topic of diversity is I started to bring it on the table when I took over this position here in April last year, basically, and we tackled it from two ends. One was that we've within the fund installed a focus group for dealing with diversity that started working last year in August. And the other topic was that we worked on our guidelines. We sort of looked at the value system that we're working in, and we sort of, as a team within the fund, together with the industry in our region, defined what's the overarching goals and values are that we want to fund films under. So we made that part of our guidelines, and subsequently also made our juries diverse. So I think, you know, for me it's almost a little bit funny that people are really reacting very strongly now to the diversity checklist that we've published. Mm-hmm. Looking from the inside, I can tell you that the much stronger shift that we did was to have properly diverse juries working within the fund and looking at the projects. Bringing those backgrounds into the decision-making process was more of a game changer than the diversity list will ever be, I dare to say. The checklist for me is a working tool that we can provide to our applicants for them to sort of to pull straight, to take a look back into their own projects. I believe that every project that has a 2020 mindset will come as a diverse project to us. I'm worried about the projects we see that come with a 1995 mindset, that are, sometimes I call them the Little Miss Sunshine projects, where people are referencing narratives, role models, images that we've seen 20 years, and it somehow shows you where people are stuck within their creative universe, within which worlds people are moving. And as Nico Hofmann just said, I think we as a society, we have moved on. I see the generation of filmmakers that has moved on. We have supported a film recently called Futur 3, which is just brilliant, and I love it, and I just don't love it before what the film is, but also before for the backstory it has, the way the filmmakers express themselves. When you speak to them, you just hear a totally different language and totally different expectations, and so there's a lot of there is clearly there's a generational topic within diversity as well, and also clear a logic within a younger generation of filmmakers, and which is reaching beyond communities. I think that is really interesting to see, and that is, I think, is enriching also to the German film industry as such, as a large.
Thank you. And I did see Futur 3, because if I'm not mistaken, and my colleagues from the Berlinale will kill me if I'm wrong, but Futur 3 did win the Teddy Awards prize.
Correct.
I think the English title for our English speakers is No Hard Feelings, if I'm not wrong.
Yep, correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it right. And I mean, this is very much emblematic of this new generation of up-and-coming diverse filmmakers from Germany, or who are living in Germany, who bring these diverse post-migratory perspectives. That's how they were very much foregrounded at the last Berlinale. I wanted to go back to the diversity checklist as essentially a data collection and awareness building tool. What do you see as the next steps? Could you could you imagine 5 years in the future introducing a points-based system based on your data or based on the results of field in film? Could you imagine creating specific funding streams for specific marginalized groups as exist in certain countries? Where do you see this going? Where do you see the next steps to take this going?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to salute Kwesi for doing the work they did with the survey. So that's, I think it's really solid way to approach it, and it's a really valid and valuable way of looking into diversity and drawing conclusions. I can imagine many things, but essentially I would like to see how we are doing with the diversity checklist for the moment. So we've just introduced it. We're getting the first round of applications in. I would like to see how people deal with it, what it does to the quality of applications, how it works as a tool for communication with our applicants. How we better understand the universe of our applicants, how our applicants maybe better understand what a diverse universe might look at, and then take it from there. So I wouldn't jump to any conclusions before I haven't seen what's really on the table, and that will take us a year at least, I think, to understand fully, to go full circle and then take it from there. Yeah, so that's where we are at the moment. I mean, what we have to see is that this is part of a cultural shift, and a cultural shift it takes time. However much we want it or don't want it, there's no fast lane in some ways. So we need to make that step in order to draw conclusions and understand what the next steps are. And at the moment, I'm quite curious to see how we work.
And you mentioned that this is a cultural shift and that this takes time. I wanted us to leap into the future. And this is me speaking from the perspective of a Black British person who comes from a country where diversity inclusion policies have existed for the past 30 years. And where we've seen over the past 3 months with the Black Lives Matter movement and the global uprising racism and the many pledges which have arisen, but also incidents of research which have been conducted by people of colour from the industry and reactions online and statements which have been made by collectives which have shown that essentially, despite some of the positive measures, which can I say some of the positive diversity inclusion strategies, so the empowerment strategies which are in place, all of the policy making, that essentially the situation of Black and other people of colour in industry, those professionals, hasn't really changed much in the last 30 years. And so I come back to this question of sustainability, right? What can be done in order to really make, really bring about sustainable change? What can be done to make sure that these up and coming, aspiring new, exciting new directors, like the directors of Futodrai, that their careers will be made sustainable within, within your region, let's say, but also on a wider German level? What can producers do? What can film funds do? What can be done?
Well, I mean, first of all, for whoever works in the industry, I think it's important that they are visible. So only if you're visible, you exist in a way, and so that goes for directors as well, goes for any talent. And I think part of what we do is to understand that and find structural ways of pushing that. Secondly, I think the way we as an industry operate is by opportunity. So we need to understand where the opportunities in diversity lie and incentivize. So wherever we think there are incentives in being diverse, I think it will make it easier for producers, for directors, for writers to see those opportunities, to see those chances. And then we, as a fund, have an obligation, or we have a responsibility. I think we give taxpayers money, at least, after all. So we have an obligation to sort of support this way. And yeah, that's maybe in a nutshell from my end.
Thank you. We are sadly at time, so I wanted to thank all of our guests, Helge, of course, Nico, Chun, Kwesi, and Susann. Thank you very much for sharing your insights, analysis, perspectives, and vision on a subject which is as complex and multifaceted as humanity itself. For all of us here listening, and for those of you watching, please stay tuned for the upcoming developments on the Diversity Inclusion Fund in Germany. I think I can speak for all of us here and that we particularly look forward to the results of the Field Fighting Film Survey. So that survey, as Kwesi said, is still online for another month, www.fieldfightingfilm. So please do access the survey, and please do stay tuned for the rest of the discussions at Carla 2020. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.